Without further ado, let's start now. I would like now to hand over to Ms. Andrej Horvat, the Deputy Head of You Lead with Europe.
Доброго дня, шановні друзі. I can start with very well welcome and thank you in the House of Decentralization to this very interesting and very, I would say, challenging event. We call it Expert Exchange. Why Expert Exchange? Because we have today expert with us. I would like to welcome, of course, first of all, Mr. Shashov, Pavlo Ostapenko, our expert. Congratulations for last year PhD. I didn't know that you have your PhD degree, so you're not loud enough about this, but really we are happy to work with such experts. Ian Mackey, our strategic advisor, and Nick Tice, also our international expert in the field of amalgamation and decentralization. Just to give a frame, You Lead with Europe program is working on 6 top initiatives. And the most important top initiative definitely is number 2, and this is acceleration of amalgamation process. This is our key task and our key job. And after we discussed this with our colleagues from the MENA region 2 weeks ago, that there is a need in the month of April and May to start a new push to the amalgamation process. We are of course very happy because we are well prepared on that, and we can even put more effort into these activities. Just to say that this expert exchange we see also in this framework in order to first of all, of course, get some international experience to see how in other countries this was done, and then also to see what we can learn from the experience from other countries. Our international experts, they were working in this field in Ukraine in the last couple of months, and they will present some interesting results. We are, of course, looking forward for Mr. Shashov and Pavlos Ostapenko's input in order to see really how we could make the deadline to have the elections in 2020 in October in one country. So we are really working into this direction, and we hope that that will be successful. I wish you really a pleasant afternoon, a lot of expert challenges to all of you, and lively discussion.
Дуже дякую, Андрею. Власне, я мала на меті представити наших
Thank you, Andrej. I am about to introduce our speakers, but Andrej's done that already, and he was talking about the context of this expert exchange. I'm going to introduce you to the agenda. So we start with the first words of welcome, just to put us in the right context. First, the speakers are going to talk about international trends in community consolidation or amalgamation, if you will, and we will then switch gears and focus more on Ukraine. Ian Mackey, Nick Tice, Sergei Shashov, and we will close with a presentation by Mr. Pavlo Ostapenko. Each speaker is going to be given 20 minutes, so it's a 20-minute presentation, and then we've set aside several minutes for any follow-up questions. If there's something that wasn't clear and you need to request clarifications, as soon as we are done with all the presentations of the day, then we will throw it open to enable you to ask questions to any of the speakers, and then we will continue more informally over or a cup of coffee, a couple of technical announcements. This event is being recorded. So, and we will post this recorded material tomorrow, and we will share the presentations, which will be attached to our thank you note after which we will send by email, and to stay on schedule and not to get distracted. I would like to kindly ask you to turn off your mobile devices or switch them to silent, and I would like to wish everyone an insightful and fruitful discussion, and would like to encourage you to be active and interactive, because this is the whole purpose of this meeting, this expert exchange this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariana and Andrei. Actually, Nick and I will present together, so our 20 minutes is going to be combined into 40, and we'll do basically a double act. So you'll see the microphone going backwards and forwards quite a lot over the next 40 minutes. But I'm going to start, and what we're going to talk about is really the learning points from both Ukraine and international experience in recent years and decades. And what we'll do is start off with, does this work? How does this go forward? Yeah. What do I need to point at?
Experts, better experts.
Yes, not technical experts. Aha. Okay, so next slide, please. We're down to 39 minutes now, Nick. Okay, so the next slide. Yes. Oh, excellent. Wait, can you do the slides and I'll do the talking? Great. So we're going to talk in three parts. Basically, start off with the overall context, looking at, firstly, from a Ukrainian perspective, where are we now? How did we get here? Where are we going? Secondly, looking at the situation in the European Union with local self-governments as a scene setter for then going into more detail about experiences of EU countries. And what we'll do is focus in particular on 6 case studies, not just from the EU, but also internationally, which we've chosen because they actually deliver some quite interesting points, I think, for Ukraine. And finally, we'll wrap up by drawing together some concluding thoughts. So if we move to the next slide. So the first section on the on the context for international experience. I really won't say very much about this slide because I think everybody's very familiar with these statistics. But as you can see, the voluntary approach that Ukraine has taken to amalgamation has been pretty successful so far, from the first wave of amalgamated Hromadas in 2015, where there were 159, through strong growth in 2016 and 17 with more than 200 amalgamations each year, a little less so in 2018, and the picture continues into 2019. As we know, we've got now 888 amalgamated Hromadas, including 75 that are awaiting elections. And I know that on Saturday there was an announcement by the Central Elections Commission that will be 66 elections on the 30th of June, so things are still moving forward. So this is where we are now, and how did we get here? Nick? Okay, so, I mean, again, you're very familiar with this story, so this is just a very quick recap. But basically, the voluntary approach is obviously codified in the Law on Voluntary Amalgamation 2015, which set out not just the process, but also various conditions, including that the quality and accessibility of services shouldn't be any worse after amalgamation than before amalgamation, and various other things. And the process itself obviously further elaborated in the Cabinet of Ministers decree in 2015. I think it's also worth noting that Ukraine is a signatory to the European Charter on Local Self-Government, which is a point I want to come back to later in the presentation. But what is, I think, significant from the decree is the definition of capability. What is a capable amalgamated Hromada? And as you'll see from the quotes here, the definition is about the ability to provide quality services within available resources and the state of infrastructure development, which is an interesting definition because it doesn't mention population coverage or any other kind of quantitative criteria for defining capability at this point. But I think people often think about the size of Hromadas as one of the more important benchmarks for understanding whether the reform has been successful or not. But it's actually not written into any law or decree. So with that in mind, let's have a look at where we are now in terms of the size breakdown of Hromadas. And these figures are going back to the graph from the 665 Hromadas we had at the end of 2017. So this is data that was produced by the Fiscal Monitoring Group in a slightly more disaggregated form than was published to show more refinement in the breakdown, if you like. And what you'll see here is that at this point where you had 665 Hromadas, by the end of last year, over 1 in 3, in fact 37% for people who like percentages, are below 5,000 employees. If you add the next size band up, which is 5,000 to 9,999, you have more than 7 out of 10 that are below 10,000, sorry, not employees, population. If you take the size bands up to 20,000, it's over 90% below 20,000 population, and there's only one Hromada which is over 40,000. So you see a pattern where, generally speaking, the size of Hromadas is still fairly small in Ukraine. So let's go forward. That's where we are now. What's going to happen next? And again, I won't talk about this at length because Mr. Shashov, Dr. Ostapenko are better qualified to talk about these things than I am. But I think it's important to remember that we've got now a proposal for a 600-day plan to finish the job in a way to complete the amalgamation by October 2020 local elections. Croc sa crocum, step by step. It's a very popular phrase around here. And as I say, I won't go into the details of this, but I think when you think about where Ukraine is now with the voluntary approach and the size breakdown we have, what comes to mind is, I think, maybe 4 questions that I want to kind of throw out as things to think about throughout the rest of this presentation and perhaps the rest of the workshop this afternoon. The first question is, should we be concerned about the large number of fairly small amalgamated Hromadas in Ukraine? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it really matter? The second thing is the large number of small Hromadas, amalgamated Hromadas, an inevitable result of the voluntary nature of amalgamation so far and the formation process, respective plans, etc.? Does that tend towards amalgamation being quite a conservative process and therefore quite small? Has the administrative territorial reform so far been successful in delivering agreement among citizens, and therefore has become quite a popular reform, but perhaps less so in delivering effectiveness and efficiency because the average size remains small? And finally, can the roadmap and the process behind it achieve what would be a dream combination of larger amalgamations and hopefully then greater effectiveness and efficiency without sacrificing the consensus and citizen agreement and participation that has happened so far, and at the same time accelerating the process? Can all those things be achieved at the same time? What can we learn from international experience that will help us understand those questions better? So with that in mind, I shall hand over to Nick.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Also, warm welcome from my side. Indeed, where can we put Ukraine now into international/European perspective? Before starting, just saying that studying this local self-government and the whole administrative governance at local level is a fascinating world. It's absolutely fascinating. Even in Europe, when looking into all the different countries, they are so diverse in the way how they tackle this issue, how they approach this issue, nevertheless struggling with the same kind of things, the same kind of issues, the same kind of problems. I'm just talking you through briefly to some headlines just to give you a brief insight into the wide difference of the whole spectrum of how Europe 28 looks like today. Starting with the levels, the tiers of government. How many levels can we see, do we distinguish in the different countries? It varies from 2 levels, and you see the countries put here. I hope you are a bit familiar with the abbreviations, but still, just want to point out that there is not one way how countries are dealing with this issue on the tiers, on the levels of government. Same question, the same issue, where also over here in Ukraine, you are struggling, looking for an answer. So, varying from 2 levels over 3 to 4 levels, even to 5 levels. Looking into Portugal and also my own country, Belgium, for one big city also has district levels, so more local levels. Within the local level, so also coming to 5 tiers. Coming to the numbers. The numbers of municipalities, and I know the countries are different. And even compared to your country, Ukraine, comparing is very, very difficult because of the size. Nonetheless, it's just interesting to see in terms of numbers. One stands out, France, with more than 35,000 communities. Others varying from also bigger countries, also having quite small numbers of municipalities. Of course, it becomes interesting when crossing this with the population. What is then average size of municipalities across Europe? And then you can see it's even more fascinating. Ranging from Czech Republic or Czechia, with an average size of 690 citizens in one municipality. Slovakia, 1,008, France, 1,008. So you have a small group of 5-6 countries below the number of 5,000. Then you have quite a, middle group between 5 and 10,000, and you can see them for yourself. Spain, Romania, Estonia, Malta. Germany as well, 7,004 on average. And then moving to the bigger numbers in terms of, starting, let's say, from Slovenia, close to 10,000, Poland, 15,000, until the very big ones. Very big ones starting from, Bulgaria, 26, Greece, 33,000, Sweden, close to 34,000, up to the really, really huge ones, Ireland, UK, the Netherlands, which having huge centers, cities, bringing together a huge number of citizens into those big cities. Interesting to see the huge variety, the huge difference. How they tackle, how they deal with this issue of local governance on the different country size and the different levels. When going into a bit the reform trends and the dynamics, this size and the amalgamation, this is one element, but only one element. It's an important one, but only one element. And this is the first one. So the administrative territorial redistribution, the work on amalgamation, non-amalgamation, this is clearly over, starting from the 60s, the 70s in Europe, this has been a common thing, a common trend. As said before, as only one of the trends. Besides this trend, there is also the more wider decentralization, even regionalization, where functions, competences are shifted towards lower levels, being it on regional level, being it on the local level. Also an important discussion here in your country. When we come later more in depth into the cases, you will see this as well. A third movement, a third dynamic, is what we call here the democratization. So this is how to bring local government really close to the citizens. The people living there, the people working there, but also as users of services, but also really as citizens. So giving citizens, giving them empowerment, empower them into the functioning, the decision-making, also of the local level, the community level. Number 4, and apologize that I sometimes have to peek at my papers, because still I cannot fully read and understand your beautiful language, but hopefully we can manage in this way. Number 4 is the service delivery. How and in what way does the local level really work on improving the delivery of the services? Of course, via the whole movement, the delivery of services online, via the internet, but also the one-stop shops and other means of doing. This is a trend that we've seen, well, across Europe, but in extenso, probably across the world, that is very strong. But definitely in Europe, this is a very, very, very strong movement. And then lastly, also a very strong thing, this is the whole idea of managerialism. This is where the capacities, the strength of managing the local level by enforcing HR, by working on strategic planning, by working on leadership, all these different elements, there is a very strong push and a very strong reform push on this element. Just to say, it's not new, but what is very important in our story is it's not only about the numbers and working on the borders and putting things into shape. It's also about what is in there, what is the flesh to the bone, how strong are the things that you create, the new municipalities that you create in terms of the other reform trends. Certainly in terms of the managerial, in terms of the service delivery, and definitely also in terms of the increased democratization. Ian, back to you.
Thanks, Nick. Do you want to hang on to that for now? Actually, do you want to go back one slide if possible? Yeah, I just want to emphasize a couple of things really. One is that the administrative territorial reform is not just about amalgamation. I mean, you've also seen the number of municipalities increase in some countries, particularly in the 1990s, linked to various political developments, fall of Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, etc. So you've seen, I think it's something like 14,000 municipalities go since the early 1990s in net terms across Europe. You've still got over 100,000 municipalities. But that is the general trend. And the other thing is the other general trend has been towards decentralization, but there's also been cases of re-centralization, if you like. I mean, in Hungary, they took powers from the counties back to central government. There's been creation of new regional or intermediate levels which have taken powers from central government and municipal government. It's a very complicated picture. And generally during crises, you tended to see centralization of powers and resources. But the general trend for decades has been in this direction. So with that in mind, Nick, can you move to the next one? And one more, which is, as I say, the main trend has been amalgamation of municipalities or reduction of municipalities. And you have to see that within a general picture of looking for the right size and structure of local self-government, which every country struggles with. And are there any fans of Monty Python in the audience? I know at least one. We've put a picture of the Holy Grail up here because Monty Python Holy Grail, because the search for the right structure of local self-government is undoubtedly the Holy Grail of governance in Europe and I think worldwide generally. So we've got some examples here from across Europe, some of which we'll go into in more detail in the case studies. But I'll just very quickly pick out the other ones because I think they illustrate a few interesting points. Firstly, Albania, a very recent development, 2015. They have 2 tiers of subnational governments. With the municipal tier, they basically said, okay, we've got too many small municipalities, so let's abolish the rural ones and merge them in with the urban ones. They did this in the 2015 elections as a top-down exercise. And they've gone from having 7,000, 8,000 population on average to having 47,000 population on average per municipality. So that's quite a big change. In Finland, they've got a very different approach. They've been amalgamating since 2005. It's been a rolling process, and they considered making it a mandatory process because they've just felt the municipalities were not effective in delivering services, but instead decided, okay, let's do this on a voluntary basis. So each year you've seen amalgamations, sometimes only 1, sometimes 30, and gradually they've reduced it to from 444 to 31 now, and it carries on. They have regional government at the same time, but that really doesn't have very many. It's not really very democratic. It's not elected. It's actually run by joint boards of municipalities. So it's a very interesting model to look at. But with the Finns, they were basically looking at a minimum threshold of 20,000 population as their kind of target. You look at Greece, very different situation again. For many years, very centralized country, started to regionalize a bit like France, and then to actually build up the municipal base more and more. And they went through 2 big programs. One was the Kapodistrias program, which was in 1997, and then the Kalakritis program, which was in 2010. And what was interesting about that was that really did build a municipal base, but it's very much linked to austerity. So they gave decentralization, a lot of powers to municipalities, but they didn't give the finances to go with it, and they halved the number of local self-government employees. So there's a question about whether you have an effective municipal base there. Ireland got rid of an entire tier of local self-government in 2014. 118 towns and borough councils who had existed for over 100 years. Turned out to be very unpopular reform. People have, they felt this kind of identity with their towns and boroughs, and there's been a lot of politicians since have said, well, we're not sure we made the right decision. We should perhaps have not been so hasty to do that. And finally, we're not covering the case studies Latvia, but again, very interesting, obviously former Soviet Union country, which decided in 2009 to get rid of its 2-tier system, districts and then municipal level, and simplify the municipal level. So you had republican cities and amalgamated Hromadas. And as you see, they've taken the numbers down from 522 in a country of a couple of million people to 119. So you could say very successful because they've achieved all the cuts they wanted, but all in very different ways. So if we move on to the next slide, before we go into the case studies, just want to draw out some common and key factors here. The first one is every country is different. Every country is unique, has its specificities. And the administrative structure in every country is a product of geography, history, traditions, ethnic mix. All these things shape the structures that they have at any moment in time and the way forward from there. But that doesn't mean you can't learn lessons from other countries. There's always something in there that's interesting for your experiences. Second thing is, in many cases, governments or even associations, municipal associations, have set out goals for what they think would be ideal population coverage. So it's quite a popular criteria, ranging from 1,000 population in one province in Canada to 100,000 in the Netherlands, which we'll come back to. Then in terms of the approach, sometimes voluntary, sometimes compulsory, sometimes a mix of the two together. We'll look at that for each of the case studies. And the pace. Is it done as an incremental or rolling process, or do they go for a really comprehensive, one-off, big bang approach where you try and do everything in one go? And as you can imagine, the compulsory tends to go with the big bang approach, and the voluntary tends to go with the incremental, but not always. So if we move on to the first case study, we've got Moldova here, which wasn't in the list before, but I think it's very interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, they have a lot of Hromadas, a lot of municipalities. For a country of 3.4 million people, they have 898 at the basic level, and on top of that they have the upper tier, but we'll focus on the 898. In 2012, they launched a national decentralization strategy, which is actually very similar in terms of the scope of what they wanted to do to what is happening in Ukraine now. It covered fiscal decentralization, allocation of responsibilities, functions, property decentralization, included territorial reform, institutional capacity building, a lot of different things. And that was originally planned to be a 3-year program, 2012 to 2015. But they've since kept rolling it forward, which tells you something. It basically tells you they're really still struggling with how to actually do this. And one of the main aspects they've struggled with is the actual amalgamation part of it. But the context for this is very interesting, and I have to consult my notes because there's a few statistics which I find quite staggering. The first is their definition of capability is actually very similar to the Ukrainian one in terms of service provision. But on top of that, they also have some very specific criteria. So according to law, no municipality should have less than 1,500 population. In practice, you've got 898 municipalities, 251 of them are below 1,500, even though it's against the law. At the same time, they have a specific regulation on a law on administrative decentralization, which says that no municipality should exceed 30% of its own revenues in administrative expenses. Out of 898, only 10 municipalities meet that rule. 888, which is a nice number, as we know, break that rule. And in fact, in some municipalities, they spend almost 90% of their expenditure just on administration, nothing else. And what the statistics show is that for a quarter of municipalities, they have less than €1 per person per year for services. This is a country in municipal crisis. Even if you take the majority of Ramadas, which is 70%, they have less than €5 per person per year for services. They're just there employing people. So they have a crisis, which is why they have a strategy. And they've been thinking about how to do this. So they first said, well, we'll have voluntary, then compulsory. And as far as I can work out, they've not made any progress with this. Now, in the meantime, UNDP stepped in and said, OK, we'll help you with this. And they commissioned 3 universities to do a mapping exercise. And they took a very interesting approach, which was to use genetic algorithms, basically using evolutionary theory, survival of the fittest, to work out different combinations of Ramadas. What would be the best options given criteria to work out what would be the best patterns in northern Moldova. And they found that you could get from 315 to 32 and save 25% of your expenditure. But so far, this has not been applied. And I suspect because in practice that looks great, but they still have to go out there and negotiate and discuss this. So they still have to face up to that. So that's the situation in Moldova. I'll hand over to Nick for the next one.
Well, for the next 3 cases would be Denmark, Estonia, and the Belgian case. We have elaborated them and documented them in far more details. So I think, and I'm looking also to Mariana and Andre, I think in any moment soon that people can also have a look in more details what we are telling now. First thing. Second, Ms. Chair, how are we on the timing?
We still have 11 minutes.
11 minutes, okay.
12 minutes.
So 12, thanks for your generosity. So I will speed it up through the cases because I think the most important thing is then also going towards the end. So quickly talk you through the cases. Denmark, well, we heard already a bit, started mid-70s from a large number, already bringing it back to, well, a reasonable number, but then decided between 2007 and 2012 to work with this 2070-71 number, reducing it top-down, and that's, well, the interesting between brackets part of this case. So they have really looked from a comprehensive approach, looking for the whole country, seeing, well, where are the municipalities, the towns, that are not meeting the minimal criteria, which was set by 20,000 people, citizens, which are the ones that are not meeting them? Okay, there we are start looking, I'm putting it simple now and fast, There they start looking, how can we put them together, how can we merge them, and it's forced, top down. So it's forced. 20,000, 30,000, that was the number for intermunicipal collaboration. So the ones that said, well, but we really don't want to merge, amalgamate, but we want to intensify collaboration. That was possible, but then the number was even enlarged towards the citizens. Interesting as well, besides the top-down element, is that it was the whole amalgamation was part of a big reform, including the territorial, but also including the functional and the financial decentralization. So a lot of comparisons and similarities to the Ukrainian story over here, except the top-down element. The Estonian case, well, it really didn't have a big numbers amalgamation before, but nevertheless they had some history before on amalgamating, but they started with a large amalgamation process, bottom up, so voluntary amalgamation process back in 2015. In terms of numbers, there the minimum number was set 5,000 inhabitants, but if municipalities were able to amalgamate upon 11,000, then there was like a financial bonus. So in any case, there was a bonus, a financial incentive included, but when municipalities went to the 11,000 threshold, there was even a higher incentive that was allocated. Interesting into this story is that they worked with two waves. They had a clearly starting date and they had a clear end date. And in between they had like a cutoff date. So the deal was, well, you can voluntary, bottom-up amalgamate until that very moment. And upon that moment, if you have not amalgamated, we take over. We, as central government, we take over. We force, top-down, we arrange, we set up the amalgamation. But it's very clearly set up, communicated from the very beginning. Of course, it triggered also some court cases, and that also, well, had an impact on the process, but I'm not going into all of the details now. The Belgian reform, well, this also has a very long history going back into the 70s, where there was the big, large reform, top-down, for the whole country, the big top-down reform program, already bringing back the 2,300 numbers into the 596. The past Flemish government, which is one of the regions in the country, they said, well, we launch a voluntary process. A voluntary process where municipalities, they can merge if they want, and the only condition is that they have a common border. So there were no criteria, no further rules, they just have to be linked geographically to each other, which would make sense, I guess. So a very interesting story. What is also very interesting here is in terms of assessing the capacity and in terms of capability, capable omradas or capable municipalities, what was developed here was a very strong monitor. So an instrument, a capacity instrument, that allowed municipalities to do a self-assessment upon their capabilities, their capacities. So it were not only financial numbers, it was also numbers on population, demographics, but also on service delivery. So it was like nearly 100 kind of indicators, metrics that were put in there, allowing municipalities to assess themselves and to find out, well, is there a basis to amalgamate, to look for partners, to amalgamate, yes or no. Ian, maybe we should skip the next ones and going into the conclusions, otherwise we will not make it, I think.
Can I just say a couple of words on these?
Your call.
Yeah, very briefly. I think what's interesting about the Netherlands is that this has been a rolling process since 1851. I mean, they established their structure in 1832, and within 20 years they decided they didn't like it, started merging municipalities. But this has been largely voluntary. It's been a mix of voluntary compulsory. But actually I'll pick up on the last point, which is about relationship with citizens' feelings about municipalities in a later slide, because they now have an average of, I think, 47,000. They're looking at a target of 100,000 minimum population. So they're getting to bigger and bigger armadas, and this is causing some issues, some questions. Canada, what's interesting about this example is that it's very much driven by compulsory amalgamation and is very much resisted by a lot of communities in these cases. And it also gives you some examples of de-amalgamation. And without going into the details, there's one particular rural area of Winnipeg with 1,200 people, which is very rural and actually successfully de-amalgamated. But it took them 21 years to do it. It's quite a painful process. And the sense you get from this is that it's very difficult. It's like making an omelette or scrambling eggs. You never get back to the original eggs. You can't unscramble them. So and this is something to bear in mind. You know, it's almost like the reform can't easily be reversed. So just to draw up some concluding thoughts from the overall case studies and what we know from international experience. First is every country is different. We know this. We also, sorry, I'm trying to find my place so I know what's written on the page. Yeah, I mean, we can say that, you know, population coverage is quite useful, but, you know, when it comes to a rule of thumb figure, you could say 20,000. There seems to be a bit of a consensus about that, but it would mean nothing. There is no ideal size of Ramada from the studies and the experience of these various countries. What we do see, however, is a correlation between scale and effectiveness. A lot of research has shown this. The bigger the Ramadas, the easier it is to deliver services, but you lose the closeness to the citizens. Seems fairly obvious. There's a trade-off. And the statistics I wanted to quote was they did a study of the various amalgamations in the Netherlands, and they compared, broadly speaking, a municipality of 20,000 with 100,000, and they found that voter turnout was down by about 11% in the larger municipalities because people felt less connected. They felt a little bit less trust in the municipality, but actually didn't stop being engaged. They were still participating in, you know, discussions, meetings, consultations. And that didn't go. That actually increased with a larger municipality. So, you know, not all is lost. You don't lose closeness completely. But clearly, the size of Ramada is not the only factor. The functions allocated to different levels is just as important. And you could argue that for different functions, you do need different efficient scales of municipality. Clearly different for transport compared with administrative services. And because of that, and because of the functional relationships between different levels, it's also important to bear in mind cooperation as well as capability. The other lesson that comes across is process counts as much as outcome. And we know from the experience of Belgium that people who went through that forced amalgamation in the 1970s still feel quite strongly about the communities they used to have. Same with Canada. And we'll see what happens with Estonia, but there's also been legal challenges there. In Canada, a lot of legal challenges because people didn't feel involved in the process. And clearly this is something that is dealt with by the European Charter of Local Self-Government. It really requires there's a participatory process under Article 5. So we'll skip past this. This is basically the framework we use to do the analysis, but it's not so important at this moment in time. We'll finish off with two slides. The first is financial capability, which comes back to the issue as we saw in Albania. Do you set a limit on administrative expenses of total revenues or whatever? Well, financial capability is extremely important, clearly, but also important is the actual responsibilities of each municipality. And so you can look at level of funding per capita as one benchmark or criteria. But in Ukraine, clearly, you also have to think about issues like, if people live in one area and they use services in that area, but they're registered elsewhere, you get effectively a transfer across the country. Same with enterprises. It may actually be to the benefit of poorer municipalities if people are living in Kiev and registered in those places. But equally, if companies register in Kiev and are actually working elsewhere, you lose that. So there's a kind of inequity potentially there. Second thing is that for municipalities, the autonomy they have to use their resources is obviously constrained if they're not setting the rates and also collecting the taxes or fees from the organisations or people that pay them. So, I mean, I won't go into any more detail on this, but I think the Levitas and Jikic research is very interesting in this regard, because it suggests that actually amalgamated providers don't have that much control over the resources that they receive. And clearly, as the final point, equalisation is very important as well. And I think it's very beneficial to the poorer municipalities in Ukraine, but it's actually a very small part of the total revenue base, only about 1%. So that's also a factor in whether Hromadas are financially capable. But also, taking a bigger picture, what does it mean to be organisationally capable? Well, clearly population coverage is one thing, and so is per capita funding, but equally important are whether resources match responsibilities, how the Hromada is organised in terms of systems and structures, the competences of the staff, whether they have necessary knowledge and personal qualities, and the leadership. How is the amalgamated Hromada directed, managed? How are staff motivated and empowered? All these things are very difficult to quantify. You can't look at different countries and say there is a definitive answer to defining capability in this regard. So I will leave it at that point and hand back to Mariana.
Дуже дякую, Єн, дуже дякую, Нік.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Nick, for your presentation and for meeting your time slot. Now, I would like to just allow some time for any follow-up questions, if any. If not, then we have time reserved after 1600 to exchange any questions. Just one small question. Can we just page back one slide? Yeah. Look, it says a fair and effective equalization system. What are the yardsticks? How do you measure that? If you have any, do you have any metrics, any yardsticks, any recommended indicators that are used to measure equity, to measure effectiveness?
Дякую.
Thank you.
Nick, Jan, are you going to take these questions? Does it need any kind of clarification, or you are going to answer it? Yes. Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, please.
That's a very, very interesting question. And I'm also conscious we don't have that much time. But, well, I think there's probably two factors. I mean, one is what's the overall size of equalisation fund? And I can't give you a straight answer to that question. I'd have to think about it a bit more, actually. I think, I mean, certainly 1% of all revenues feels too low. But also I think you have to look at how it actually functions in practice across the quartiles of municipalities. And certainly in Ukraine, I mean, the poorer municipalities do benefit very well from the equalisation fund. I mean, they get about 12% of the resources. You know, when we talk about 1% fund, that's quite substantial. And the difficulty with equalisation is striking the balance between avoiding a situation where the rich Hromadas just keep getting richer and the poor Hromadas keep getting poorer because of their natural resources, which is the first thing you want to do, without creating disincentives. If you make it too redistributive, then actually, it in fact rewards staying small and ineffective and poor. So getting that balance right is very difficult. And I think the system at the moment, as I understand it, I think it doesn't quite get it right. And part of the reason is it's kind of it's fiscally neutral, as I like to say in finance ministries. It's self-financing. Whereas I think with equalisation funds, you also need to be looking at government transfers to, not just to leave it to Hromadas transferring money amongst themselves. So I don't think there's a straightforward, simple answer, but I like the question a lot. It's something I shall go away and think about now, because it's clearly a very important one, actually.
Дуже дякую, Єн. Юрій Івановичу, я думаю, що ми зможемо
Thank you,
поговорити
Ian.
після 4-ї
We will have plenty of time to discuss this after 4 p.m. And this indeed is a very substantive question, which probably warrants further discussion. So, unless we have any follow-up questions, let's now hand over to the next speaker, Sergey, just to summarize and maybe just end. What is certain that Ukraine is in the mainstream in terms of trends, in terms of this broad move towards decentralization and devolution. I would like to maybe address some of the findings presented by Nick and Ian. Is that Ukraine, certainly one of the challenges Ukraine has quite a large number of pretty small communities, and one more, is that the direct consequence of the process of amalgamation having been voluntary today? And that's one more thing that the two speakers left open. How do we keep up the current pace of amalgamation? How do we ensure that they stay capable, and how to empower and involve the residents? How to continue adhering to this consensual principle of amalgamation? Thank you. I suggest how I want to run my presentation based on way that my predecessors made their presentation, basically using the same logical concept of how things were, how things are now, and how we got to this point. So it's okay. Going back to the 1st of January 2015, when the process just started. So if we were to look at some statistics characterizing Ukraine's territorial division, so it's one thing is that Ukraine at the time had around 12,000 municipalities whose population coverage varied quite substantially, but 47% of all those municipalities were underpopulated, under 1,000 residents. But at the same time, about 90% of the total number of municipalities at the 1st of January 2015 were under 3,000. That was the lay of the land, if you will, as of that moment. And conscious of the challenges that were facing us at the time, Ukraine clearly suffered basically the problem was that it was to decentralize in terms of the size of the municipality. So the three scenarios. Proposed one was just to hold on to the status quo, and that actually had continued for 25 years prior to that. Just okay, let's go along with what we have. So while this was the policy, we had about 600 communities disappear from the map of Ukraine, but the number of municipalities at the same time rose by 1,000, while 600 villages actually died, or parishes. So actually, the creation of new municipalities catalyzed what we call depopulation. So when this was proposed alongside the other two scenarios, that the first one, this status quo, was certainly not the one chosen, but Ukraine at that time was actually looking at the processes that were unfolding in Europe and in such countries as Estonia and Latvia that were embarking on an administrative and territorial reform. We have notes from one expert who's present here today, so notes that he or she made back then about the process of reform in Latvia. We're also observing the amalgamation process in Albania and France, and we all came to the conclusion that all those efforts eventually fell back on the good old mandatory approach, that having played up with this bottom-up approach, but eventually it all ended in an administrative decision that was passed either by the executive government or by the parliament of the country, then handed down to spur up and complete the process. But quite a wide gamut of solutions and methods have been used in most of these cases. Either some voluntary amalgamation was allowed. France certainly stands out. France having over 37,000 communities, not all of them capable, but they argued that the process of amalgamation was a process of wrapping up democracy, whatever the term was, basically, that would certainly reduce the level of democratization. But still, there was a genuine need to implement a territorial reform in earnest by chunking up those municipalities to create larger ones. Having suffered the negative consequences of an imperative reform of 2004. So that scenario was also discarded, and the scenario that was eventually chosen envisages the passage of two acts of legislation, the one that would allow armadas to amalgamate voluntarily, and the other path was to adopt a voluntary amalgamation act, which was supported by the government, and in 2014 Cooperation of Amalgamated Armadas Act was passed. The other one on voluntary amalgamation got stuck in Parliament, sparking up quite strong discussions, and because the first title of that bill was the right of communities to amalgamate, and then effectively would empower the local municipalities to seek amalgamation, but they had to go by the long-term plan to be approved by the government or something. But eventually we ended up approving a policy that now allows a fully voluntary process. The downside is that we now have quite a large number of small communities, but because the Parliament of Ukraine so decided, now we have amalgamated armadas with a population some around 1,100 people or something. At the same time, Parliament adopted the Voluntary Amalgamation Act in February 2015. In April, the Cabinet of Ministers passed a resolution, a decree, basically to put more flesh on the bones, to identify specific criteria for amalgamation that's actually containing those essential definitions. Capable community, what is the long-term armada formation plan, and then again how to ensure that the newly amalgamated armadas become viable and sustainable in terms of their ability to provide services. And based on their long-term plans, a decision was made that there was no need to peg it to population size, but not of the entire population, but to the number of children, because there are some armadas whose total population is 3,000, maybe 5,000. But importantly, maybe 80 to 90% of that population is the elderly or pensioners, those who are not quote unquote effective economically. So in that certainly compromises the economic viability of the Hromada. But if young people dominate there, that they have children, and this certainly this means that the Hromada holds also potential. So based on this, so actually following the passage of the Act, so we started discussing the implementation with some experts, and there was quite a fair degree of pessimism around that time. But we were quite surprised when the process actually took off and actually started picking up more strongly compared to some other countries that had actually followed the same path in prior to that. So we spent only 5 months, and we had our first 159 amalgamated territorial Hromadas. Then this was further sped up during 2016, and we currently have a total of a little over 880 amalgamated communities. Speaking more specifically about the law and how it's been implemented, so the law is actually divided into two parts. Part one talks about the voluntary nature of the process of amalgamation itself, and the other part is made up of it basically handles the whole business of what's a long-term community plan. So the first deals with the process of formation of a voluntarily amalgamated Hromada, and it's actually the voluntary nature is actually mainstreams the whole this whole part of law. This actually consent is very essential. All those communities need to agree to an amalgamation. It's actually an important part of this act is that the government, together with the provincial administration and the provincial council, the subnational level of government, basically, they should create a more viable vision for their administrative division, basically, of number of municipalities and the sizes and everything. If we look at those long-term plans, is basically the joint view of the government and the national government and the provincial authorities on how to run the amalgamation process. We only have 81.5% that have adopted the plans. We are having issues with the province of Transcarpathia that we've been struggling for 5 years now. So they haven't been particularly forthcoming in divulging their plan to amalgamate the communities. And how to hand over some of those powers to the central government from the provincial authorities. So it's now the next slide is the process itself of amalgamation, how it's gone on. We have 898 amalgamated Hromadas, and we have leaders, we have outsiders. It's been symmetrical, and we've had a decision passed by the Central Electoral Commission. They've appointed additional elections to be held at 66 more Hromadas. And speaking of our mentality, if you will, so the mindset. So we've had some that have taken just a certain weight position, like they just wanted to look at those that had already gone into this amalgamation process, and they did it. And when they started seeing them succeed, so that's what got them motivated. That initially they had not been so excited about putting the foot in the water, but then that's what brought about those amendments to the law, allowing communities to join those that have already gone through the amalgamation process. Many of those amalgamations took place in those provincial cities that whose satellite communities eventually volunteered themselves as candidates to be amalgamated with those cities, and we also succeeded in connecting over 100 small borough councils of small villages. They eventually made their decision to join the bigger fish. So next, then, now, if we were to look at the some stats on how this process has been unfolding, as we can gather from the slide. So we had this initial number 159 back in 2015, followed by 207, 2016, to 299, and 80 plus 82. Then it's an interesting statistic. In 2015, we had one that existed for a year, and then they realized that they were not functional, and they reloaded the process. They eventually re-amalgamated. So the first attempt sort of failed. They had 5 municipalities coalescing, so to speak. Then they realized that that was not a viable construct, and then they decided to do it again. And then they pulled in 12 smaller municipalities, and they now to form a viable community. Currently, we have total population 9.1 million people living in amalgamated. It's more stats about geographical coverage. In terms of the number of amalgamated communities, we currently have 4,000 or something municipalities have decided to amalgamate, forming 888 amalgamated armadas, now adding about 25 per month, and now the total number of municipalities is going down. Those that have yet to step on board. Next slide, please. Now, if we were to look at the profiles of those armadas, basically those that now form parts of an amalgamated armada, now at 5.1, currently it's 4.7 armadas per one amalgamation. That's just a big average. In terms of population size, we as of 2015 we had 8,700 something. It's currently 10,277 on average. Why this evolution? Why plus 2,000? It's because we've also now included provincial cities, large metropolitan areas. So it's like we look at those brackets up to 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. So a larger proportion of those lie in the band 5 to 7,000. So the average amalgamated community has a population of anywhere between 5 and 8,000 people. Now, we've been having some issues with some of those communities where these amalgamation processes have been stuck or else moving at a snail's pace. There are some parts of the country where they've produced zero amalgamations. At the same time, there are clear leaders who are leading the pack in terms of the number of amalgamations. So, in terms of, if we were to name the leaders with Khmelnytsky, Zhytomyr, I'm not going to name the outsiders. You can look at the slide. So this is just a table with some population numbers and the number of ongoing amalgamations, some statistics, and just summarizing the provincial ratings in terms of where they stand vis-a-vis one another. Now, if we look at the population numbers, if we were to add the population of those provincial cities and the residents of amalgamated communities, so it's about a third of Ukraine's population. is still has been to date left out of this ongoing amalgamation process. So if we were to name some of the challenges and issues that we have encountered, so if we were to analyze, the current state of affairs based on the constitution of Ukraine, so in 2020 we are scheduled to have a big local election to elect our municipal elect officials. So according to statistics, about a third of the population or communities are still, those municipalities are still governed by the so-called district, state district administrations, basically the local offices of central executive authority. So basically, if this amalgamation process continues unfolding at the current pace, it's quite probable that by October 2020 we will have created municipalities with varying levels of authority and powers, but some will remain as they are, that is being governed by the central government through those district administrations. So this is what we will probably end up with. Some of those will be those newly amalgamated communities, the provincial cities, and those old municipalities. That is not acceptable. That is not. It's not fair vis-a-vis those residents who live in those areas that have yet to be included. So it's and individual municipalities from the same province. So effectively, we have seen newly amalgamated communities whose boundaries neatly match the administrative boundaries of the so-called rayons. So effectively, we have several layers of governance. We have the central government hierarchy and those administrations and municipalities, and there will be quite a lot of overlapping and duplication of various functions. And those, it's going to be quite a challenge for your average voter to work out which they should see if they need something, who to approach. We need to sort of to rectify this, otherwise we are going to have too much variety, basically, and it's not in a good way. So in this process is going to drag on for at least another 5 years, unless we have resolved all these challenges by the election date. So it's there is another crucial piece of legislation, the Cooperation of Territorial Communities Act, and this has been not blueprinted, but borrowed from France. This is an alternative route without amalgamation. It's like a contract, a compact, if you will, that municipalities just form an association to address some of their issues jointly by pooling resources. Now we have 975 municipalities that have entered into 381 intermunicipal cooperation agreements, mostly in the province of Poltava in central Ukraine. But it's actually it's a process that is certainly spreading. It's certainly going to continue. Now, as regards our end game and basically the final model, it's now the Ukraine is now actively embarking on medium-term budgeting. The Ministry of Finance has formulated or specified the number of local budgets that they feel Ukraine should have. Now, there are two scenarios: best case and worst case, pessimistic versus optimistic. So, under the optimistic, the pessimistic one. So, the government, the executive government, will be given the authority to set up as many budgets as they find appropriate or expedient. So it's actually, we're going to have not more than 1,100 base level municipalities. At the same time, we are quite appreciative of the situation and some of the provinces as regards the creation of those long-term plans and how those communities have been faring that have already implemented the long-term plans. So based on a pessimistic scenario, we're talking something like 1,400 municipalities in total. But a full detailed analysis with those numbers, 1,100 versus 1,400. So, but basically, we're going to have something like 1,300 bottom-level municipalities. At the same time, we should also remember about the importance of the sub-regional level of government. So basically, this base level, so in many cases, the boundaries closely match or completely match the hierarchy and the boundaries of the central government hierarchies, the administrations, and this it's actually something to be resolved by the Parliament of Ukraine. This is something that Pablo is going to present on, and we have developed guidelines on how to go about building this sub-regional level. We're talking about 100 rayons, as they're called originally, in the oblast, in the provinces. And it's a decision has been adopted by the government to implement a new phase of the ongoing local self-governance reform that should culminate in the creation of a new territorial framework to enable the operation of municipalities, whose objective will be to create a new territorial frame or scaffolding, if you will, to underlie to be the basis for the upcoming local elections in 2020. And it's actually local governments, and it's also state administrations, and budget law should also be amended, but that's a separate discussion. So I would like to now hand over to Pablo. We were slightly lagging behind. Do we have any follow-up questions? If not, then let's introduce the next speaker. Pablo, the floor is yours. Over to you. Your time slot is 20 minutes, and I'm sitting on a lot of questions already. So I think we will just, when we are done with this formal part, presentations, then. Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I have the good fortune of speaking last, and I would like to use my time slot to speak about this base level and this upper boundary and lower boundary, whatever they're called, and the sub-regional level of which Sergei spoke just now. I would like to begin with some historical background about how our administrative division has evolved. Not only local self-governance, but also the territorial division and setup of the country. According to my research, it's our fifth way of administrative division. It's since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's like our fifth attempt. But that one had existed from 1925 all the way to the and then it survived until 2014. Actually, that's when the reform started, and the fact that we continued living or surviving, if you will, under that old administrative division speaks for itself, and that's probably the single largest factor responsible for losing entire villages and communities and city growth going out of control. And it's just what I would like to demonstrate on this slide is why is administrative division, how it is connected with municipality management. And there's a quote from the law. Its local governance is the right guaranteed by the state to govern itself, something like this. But apart from that, we have the executive hierarchy that also manages or governs through their administrations. And they execute public policy aimed at enforcing national legislation and so on and so forth. And this is where they part ways, and this chart actually shows the total number of municipalities and individual councils of villages. And going back to Sergei's point that we currently have a little over 27,000 towns and villages basically that qualify as the lowest level of municipalities. We have a little under 12,000 councils basically, and then followed by rayons and oblast provinces. But there are those that some exist, but they do not figure on the list of municipalities. But okay, to cut the long story short, we have those local governments, but we also have the state, the executive hierarchy, the administrations, and those boundaries are quite blurred between the remits of your local council and the local administration. And it's really important to emphasize that this hierarchy represents the interests of the residents and those villages. They are as municipalities or units, but this hierarchy is about executing executive authority as delegated by the national government authorities within a certain municipality. Okay, the base level, some numbers. We have now a total of around 1,300 amalgamated communities covering about 81.5% of Ukraine's total area. So we need to set a cap. Different numbers have been proposed since 2014 in terms of what would be our target number. And actually, we were tasked with making some calculations based on those that have been already approved and those odd gaps to fill, 27%. It's a little under 1,500, which is the cap that we should stay within under this pessimistic scenario. And also, we did some additional work how many there would have been if those policies had been strictly enforced. So the total number would be lower. It's only 1,029, just to show how it all works. Maybe not the whole of Ukraine. I simply don't have the time to cover all of Ukraine. But how it's been working using Kharkiv province as an example, as a case study. You have 10 minutes because there's time also reserved for follow-up questions. Okay, just to use the example of Kharkiv. Okay, It has what's known as a long-term plan. On 98% of the provinces covered, those are those gaps that we need to bridge, whether they're going to amalgamate within this patch, or they're going to join some other communities. But we are looking at capability. That's what we would like to explore, and how to go about calculating or assessing Hromada capability. So we developed an algorithm, and it has 4 stages or phases, and we initially wanted to select the kind of metrics that would serve as most insightful measures of capability. This is no doctrine or dogma. It was our first quick and dirty attempt, dating back to 2016. At that time, we'd only collected the data from 159 Hromadas in 2016. The first calculations were made. And out of that total body data that had been drawn from that research, we identified 3 groups of indicators, and some are incentives and disincentives, or stimulators and stimulants, counter-stimulants. So it's then again, so a disincentive is like the level of reliance on subsidies. So certainly 70% is too heavy. Reliance, it's certainly not a good thing. So we also conducted some sensitivity analysis. We assigned weights to those various measures, and we used various methods to do cluster analysis to identify the percentage of basically which Hromada falls under which cluster of low capability, no capability, low capability, highly capable. So it's so we analyzed this feedback. We determined our clusters, and then we the clusters that we identified, and then we use this formula, and we knowing the value for each community. So we then presented a classification. Those are those discriminating indicators, the 10 basic ones that was based on the initial 159. So we picked like 2 communities, like Shumska and the one in Dnipropetrovsk, and revenue per capita in 2016 almost the same. Now, reliance on subsidies, and again, pretty much the same picture. Outlay per pupil, per school student, then again, on a par. But the sizes are very different, 500 and 121. And population, 21,000 versus 6,000. In terms of, as of that time, 2016, that's financially above average. Reliance on subsidies was moderate, not very high. But when we then ran those numbers through our formula, the Shumska, this fell under the highly capable bracket, and Sursko-Litovska 34 something. We need to. It's fell in under the bottom bracket, basically. This was our first quick and dirty attempt. We've done 3 iterations, just fine-tuning the model as we build up more data. Now, if we go back to Kharkiv, so the first map was this big plan with this projected division is you see some colors. So the green ones are capable, or highly capable. The pink ones sort of moderate, and the red ones have low capability. So we're not chasing after any like a excessive equalization, that we don't want to have any incapable ones. There's bound to be, but we certainly are committed to reducing the number. But we originally had 59, now we've got 48 following this analysis, following this capability analysis, and how our averages have improved by average population size, by land area. It's not just that each country is unique, so is each province, each region. And each has its own peculiar features, if you will. So in Kharkiv, the average size is going to be 653, and in one of Frankivsk it's less than 300, because the number of municipalities is almost the same, but the sizes and population densities are very different. Now I'm already running out of time. Sergey showed this slide over here, how the sub-regional level should be reformed. So the base level is more or less clear. I just wanted to show you how this capability is computed at this level. Now, the challenge is very clear. So the green color is in this, where something needs to be done about this. So the powers of local state administration, the law provides that they exercise local self-governance functions delegated to them. So it's a pretty strange legal construct. It's just that by way of delegation, that those administrations have been charged with executing those functions simply because their local governments are incapable of doing the job. This is based on Yuri's presentation. So I did not contribute much to this particular part of the. But as regards our modeling and how to the rayon level, we need to have a model for the base level, and it's already been built. Now we need to conduct an analysis of those regional circuits or counties or something. So it's okay. The territorial division is we have the rayon state administrations, and then in the oblast of Kharkiv. So the most popular ones are the Social Insurance Fund, the Pension Fund, the Fiscal Service, and the Police. So obviously I'm running out of time, but this is another know-how. These arrows point at the color of each arrow. Basically shows where residents travel to get those different kinds of services. It's like it's not this. It's just whenever services are provided through inter-municipal cooperation, basically with several districts covered. So it's whenever residents from one community have to travel, they have to go to different places. They have to travel in different directions to get different services. That's why we needed this. It is to identify those hubs with most of those territorial services being provided. Those are the 5 hotspots, and this would eventually help make the right decisions. In parallel to this, the Ministry of Regional Development and ULEAD together have developed guidelines to come up with criteria of municipal division. It's the 150,000, and they should be set up in provincial centers and cities with a population of at least 50,000, and those districts should include communities and within 60 kilometers at most. Now, this is in Kharkiv. We mark those cities, and we identify those with a population in excess of 50,000. It's Kharkiv, the provincial capital, and Lozova. Then we plot 60 kilometers, and we just draw a circle, and we calculate the population living within this band and outside this band, and then because what lies outside, then we have those western, southern, and there we have to the north less than 78,000, and to the south 359. So we need to look at the east because the population density is high there. At this slide that I originally skipped, are those towns and villages that could serve as anchors for amalgamation for those lying outside those boundaries. So if we look 60 kilometers here, 60 kilometers here, 60 kilometers here. Now we need to fill the odd gaps, and based on the largest density of central government authorities, so experts on we can't decide. We can make a recommendation on where to place those new centers. So those individual cities here. And from Pervomaites, there's 170,000 more people living here, but 4 are proposed as sub-regional districts. So Pervomaisk is still a question mark. So I'll be happy to discuss this in more detail if you're interested. So those are questionable in terms of ease of access to services as measured by the time it takes to get to this future sub-regional district capital, and basically that models the number of population living within a certain number of kilometers. So this is how we built this picture. And 2 more minutes and I'll be done. Okay, Kharkiv province. So the current is almost 3,000 people working at the current rayon administrations. 387 million spent to maintain them. 190 territorial units, 50 inter-district units. After this modeling, this is what we ended up with. This is a useful exercise just to demonstrate the effects. And under these assumptions, based on some experts and their recommendations, whom I support, then we should have. So the new district administration should have not more than 150 So it's 4 districts and 600 as the total number. And the amount, the budget, it's 4 and 27. It's hard to compare. But we need to improve the quality of our staffing capacity. We need to at least raise the salary rates maybe 2.5 times. So that's why the economy is substantial, but not commensurate with the dramatic reduction in the number of districts. So if this begs the question, where are all these people going to go? There is a dearth of competent human capacity at the base level. So there will be plenty of job opportunities opening up there. So the as is and the to be and those rayons, the districts, just to complement Sergei's slide. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian controlled territories will have 92 rayons and Crimea, and the occupied territories 3, Donetsk, Lugansk, 92 plus 10, 102. That's what we actually wanted. We wanted to have about 100 sub-regional districts. That's I certainly wanted to. Thank you, Pavlo. Now I think we. So now I would like to throw it open for any questions, any follow-up questions, because we actually set the piece quite fast, and while our audience are thinking about the questions they're going to ask. Now, our speakers are preparing to answer any questions. Pavlo, can you explain why is Ivano-Frankivsk going to have 5 districts and Ternopil 4? If you'd asked me about Poltava, no, I've done my own modeling. How come you are proposing 5 in Ivano-Frankivsk and your methodology? That methodology is not mine. Thank you. That the modeling, we are not independent in the sense that because we are working under a contract from the Ministry of Regional Development, we have to follow their guidelines and meet their expectations coming in from the ministry. So I agree that the Ivano-Frankivsk shouldn't have more than 3, and I understand and I agree, but that is sort of the product of compromise. But it's like the target number was 100, but now we actually we have 2 more, 102. Microphone. Okay, let's adopt our ground rules now. Please raise a hand anytime anyone wishes to ask a question. Please raise a hand, and Maria will be helping you. I'm going to hand over to her, and I'm going to moderate the process of answering the questions being asked. Director of the Kiev Center of Local Governance, just as a practitioner, question to you, Pavlo. I was paying my undivided attention to your presentation. Especially, I liked your formula, calculation of capability for amalgamated communities. I have a whole bunch of questions now to ask. I'm not going to ask them all. This formula appears so highbrow, so complex. If I approach capability calculations like this, I'm not going to create a single one. I made a very simple calculation using my budget calculations. Have you traveled to Syrsk-Litovsky, that community? I've been there too. Look, and you scored them lowest, very low, in the lowest bracket. It's not a view that the local population would share, because it's like the financial capability and how you go about calculating it is fairly subjective. It's a judgment call. Was it a comment? It was a comment, not a question. Sergei, I'm going to now use my prerogative as chair, and I've been noting down questions during all the presentation, especially when Pavlo was talking. What are some of the ministry's plans? How to basically reconcile those various visions or for the number that we should have and criteria of viability or capability? Is there any kind of holy grail, if you will? So that the two scenarios, an optimistic one, a pessimistic one. So we came up with the based on the number of budgets for the medium-term planning effort. So it certainly has a strong link between the number of budgets allowed by the Ministry of Finance and the number of municipalities themselves. So based on those calculations, they produce two numbers. If we strictly go by the guideline for capable community formation, then the number would be a little over 1,029. But at the same time, some have already completed the amalgamation, and we now have those long-term plans that, quite frankly, do not really comply with that capable community formation guideline. We have some gaps. So we are talking maybe 1,500 communities that would be regarded as capable. Now, there's a number of bills in Parliament. One of those bills seeks to replace the current Administrative and Territorial Division Act of Ukraine, expected to be debated in Parliament pretty soon. There's also 9515. This is a bill that seeks to vest in the executive government the authority to approve the number of capable communities based on the methodology, but referring to the European Selgonas Charter. So we should also take into account the views of the local residents themselves, those communities. So if those bills are passed into law, so there is the hard scenario where the number of communities will be kept down to 1,100, but then a more voluntary approach that could result in 1,500. So the compromise would be somewhere in the middle, maybe 1,300 would be what's to be expected. So it's very easy to verify whether a newly amalgamated community is viable or not, and whether it's been successful or not. There are some have refused to take over the local school, the local hospital. It's actually part of their remit, but some have been really reluctant to exercise those powers, which is not a good sign. Now, Sergey, and as you were explaining, there is this best case scenario, worst case scenario, and compromise. How are we going to actually strike this compromise, find this trade-off? How are you going to go about it? So what is the role of those amalgamation working groups, and are they outside this process? Are going to facilitate? Are they a tool facilitating this? The government has directed us with and all provinces except for Transcarpathia, working groups have been set up by the Ministry of Regional Development together with the Spatial Planning Group. Proposals have been made to be discussed by this working group, and there's that during the meetings together with regional authorities and local governments representing local councils, where we are going to make relevant decisions and come up with compromise solutions for both levels, base and sub-regional. Now, discussions have started in Ivano-Frankivsk. How many sub-regional districts to have 3 or 5 working group meetings have also been held in Kharkiv. When we traveled to Kharkiv, the representatives of the of the regions, of the experts and the local governments and the provincial administration insisted on creating 12 sub-regional districts. Our bid was 4. Now, we did some horse trading, and now the number is about 6 or something, so that's a political compromise. I would like to make a couple of remarks. Foreign colleagues spoke about Denmark and Ukraine being very similar, and indeed we actually explored the Danish experience very closely, but we made several mistakes. If we look at the Voluntary Amalgamation Act, so those methodologies and the so-called long-term plan now have lost their relevance to the actual amalgamation process. We seem to have hollowed out the substance of this. We have capable communities under 5,000. So it's actually, if a community is considered capable under 5,000, so it completely kills the motivation of large villages with 5, 6, 7, 8,000. And they go, wait a minute, if you've got communities that have actually gone through amalgamation and they have a smaller population than us, why seek amalgamation? What's the incentive? So we need to look at maybe we need to revise our approach, and then particularly use those large villages as centers of gravity to encourage amalgamation with satellite smaller communities around them. Because this certainly incentive is that they would benefit from direct interbudgetary relationships, but at the same time the small ones should be disqualified, those not willing to assume the new powers. If the amalgamated community is not willing to take up the challenge of financing local education, then they're not viable by definition. So this is an opportunity for us to open up. We need to open up this opportunity in front of large village councils to encourage them to seek amalgamation with small communities around them. So this is something that shouldn't be elevated to the level of an act of parliament. It's something that the cabinet of ministers has the power to decide. So it's it's what you showed, those routes and those long distances. It's only officials that travel to those locations because they can draw their per diem. But local residents, they get served at the place closest to them. They don't really travel that far. Well, it's not a comment to respond to a comment. It's just a comment in its own right. So I agree with my colleagues with Greater Kiev. So it's those calculations are quite indeed important, but then again, we need to not as much seek to make a fine, precise calculation. We need to establish thresholds, some cutoff levels. So like in some Baltic countries, it's only it's physically impossible to amalgamate. Maybe there is a swamp or something between two communities. So we try to make some calculations about education. So for instance, so the funding should be based on the population size, because otherwise they will end up being blackmailed by those communities, always complaining about being underfunded. So apart from those 4 important points, that was like the configuration, those various shapes, some like donuts, some are like really long and thin, and if it's still, access is not really key, but it's the efficiency of bureaucracy and how it operates. It's just to make it complex enough to keep the bureaucrats busy. But the issue of cohesion, it's a matter of it's what should be the heart of it is how to breed cohesion and how to encourage people to identify with their communities. It's one more dimension that we haven't looked at, is that whether or not we're going to set up local executive state administrations, basically. So logically, we should have a police station. We need to have an ambulance unit. We need to have some social services. So it's a question if we have had the ambition to create communities that go like only show off and just put on airs and everything. Is it a really a sensible investment for the government to set up all this necessary infrastructure necessary for a community to operate? It's how to proceed from viability considerations rather than just, okay, because now I am a community in my own right, I want to have everything that goes with it. Like another important principle is principle of harmony or solidarity, if you will. So, okay, if we look at Kharkiv region, so some of the communities, some are very green and some are very red. This is not acceptable. This means that this is a conglomeration of loosely connected pieces, not stitched together. Look, we can't have like a community like using gold to pave the streets or something, being so wealthy and so well-to-do, and next to a completely impoverished community living from hand to mouth. We need to seek equalization, sometimes against the wishes of the rich, of the wealthy communities. We need to connect those impoverished communities reasonably to the wealthier ones, and the equalization approach, and they should be a lot tougher to incentivize wealthier communities to seek amalgamation with their poorer neighbors, because now they are not interested. Look, we don't want those beggars. We don't. But look, whose headache is that? Who's going to help the poor? And that's like, it's those, maybe some of those, the local leadership are very ambitious about spending. Like, if reasonable caps are set, like 20% of what you collect is what you can spend to run the show, to the community, basically. Those are very sensible. And we need to have fewer indicators. We shouldn't get too carried away with all those calculations and management and everything, because, okay, let's keep it simple. If the smallest communities, 200, then it's like those cut-off points. Then anything below is automatically disqualified. So then you need to seek some sort of association with Mason something. So it's like we should keep it simple and straightforward. Thank you, Yuri. Now, my question is to Sergey. Now, we have spoken about the example of Denmark several times, and this it shows that this country has evolved over the decades, and then eventually they decided to administratively impose an amalgamation strategy, something, and we were now. Yuri just raised this whole issue of criteria and methodology, and just speak because that's as in that was not the. So basically, when is the minister going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's over this in terms of establishing finite cut-off dates or deadlines? Okay, we've been running this on a voluntary basis, and at some point we're going to switch to a top-down approach. So in terms of criteria, those are clearly spelled out by relevant government decrees. If those criteria were being strictly observed by the provinces, then we'd be now reaching our optimistic number of amalgamated communities. Now, in terms of when, in terms of a cut-off date or a deadline past which it's all going to become imperative, so do rest assured that we are law-abiding citizens and we operate in strict compliance with the constitution and laws of Ukraine. Should such amendments be approved, such as those in Bill 9515, then we would certainly complete this process of formation of the base level, and based on that we would then proceed to developing proposals for the Parliament of Ukraine to eventually resolve the sub-regional level. If, however, we were to establish a deadline. So, under the Constitution, there is a very clear red flag. Is October 2020. Is the next local election day period, basically. In this context, the Ministry of Regional Development, the ministry that I represent, we have drafted a number of bills that have been submitted to Parliament. We've also set up a number of working groups at the regional administrations, and we are ready to engage in consultations, and we were ready to implement the base level and then generate and submit proposals to the government on how to go about the sub-regional level. So it all depends on the pace of things in Parliament. But it's just like to reiterate the point about the risks, that if the process, the ongoing amalgamation, should continue at its current pace, then Ukraine will invariably end up with this motley collection of communities varying in size and authority and what have you, and importantly varying in the approach to elections and everything, and we can end up with several layers of administrations, different kinds, with the same powers. Anatoly Parkhomyuk of the Volyn Local Governance Development Center. Question to Pavlo. When you were talking about the sub-regional level, you mentioned that the amalgamation of communities, and basically, eventually, some of those, they match the topography, basically the same boundaries with the sub-regional district boundaries. What if it's not a match, and then those districts cannot secure a decision from the Central Electoral Commission to appoint a local election? So it's still pretty much work in progress. We're working on it, yes. And the second challenge that keeps coming up, it's something that we've encountered in our own provinces, when specific villages or towns get spun off from their host communities, and much of that is now stuck in court because some have challenged the entire amalgamation process, seeking to get a carve-out from the amalgamation process, something, if I understand him correctly. So it's something, all these complications should also be explored. I'm going to start by addressing your second question about those carve-outs or spin-offs. But 3 years ago, when the reform had not yet picked up pace, I'd been involved in developing and doing spatial planning at Gorokhiv Council, and that particular part under the plan, they would have had 4 amalgamated communities. There is Gorokiev Berestechko, and it's a pretty small town, but it is a historical heritage site or something. And there is one that is certainly a good candidate, but is not seeking to be is not expected to become one. So basically, this is amalgamation in this region. And I believe that this higher boundary, 446 communities, is not going to rise significantly, because the bottom line is that incapable amalgamated communities keep popping up, and it's not about sheer number of those communities. It's not a target in and of itself. I grew up in a village. Now it is an amalgamated hromada, but it's capable, it's viable, while the local butter factory is still running. If it's closed down, then this will kill the community. So the planning process should identify all those outliers, and we're happy that this optimum number of about 1,000 has been supported by the ministry, but that is the perfect scenario. When we have successfully resolved those outliers, what kind of outliers? In the sense that we're investing substantial funds into maintaining petty, very small-sized administrative units or layers. We are an European country, but we're not a wealthy country. We can't afford to pay salaries to short-sighted local officials not willing to change something. Now, the recipe is as follows. We will probably go down the path of opting for the midpoint, basically, in terms of the number of communities that we will eventually see. I've traveled to Zaporizhia region, so it's quite active. They have a very high number of amalgamated communities. They had a government audit, and it's like quite a large number of small communities, hromadas, under 3,000, found to have embezzled quite substantial funds. And it's had they been part of larger communities, then those funds might not have been embezzled in the first place, because tighter controls would have been established and would have applied. So it's often like many experts are sort of accused of being like killing communities that want to be viable. Well, it's a nice like soundbite. If it is a viable community, if it is entered into municipal cooperation arrangements or something, so be it then. No. Cities and urban communities, and it's like the rich have sort of amalgamated, and the government continues picking up the tab on the poorer ones. And but the marginalized communities is allowed to carry on in its original status, going by the old laws, with one or two villages that are responsible for 70% of the district budget revenues. Then they sort of detach themselves from the toxic waste, basically. This only makes this disparity worse. Unless we probably should continue this over coffee, I don't mind. So unless anyone has any pressing questions, let's thank our speakers. I think this was a very useful discussion. Now, just to go back from Nick spoke about so many countries still searching for the Holy Grail. And then certainly Ukraine is maybe halfway through. We're still looking for it, and it's probably, we will see, time will show. So I would like to wish everyone every success in pursuing this. Let's enjoy a coffee now. Thank you.